On December the 8th, 2024, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad fled Damascus for Russia as rebel forces closed in on the capital. His family's 54-year-old dynasty, and with it the last Ba'athist government on earth, collapsed. When ideologies die, they usually leave something behind. There are those who look fondly on the Soviet times with nostalgia, and even fascism, nearly a century after its defeat, still maintains a following in parts of the West. Today, the Ba'ath Party holds exactly one seat on earth, a lone representative in Lebanon's parliament, who very well may be the last to be elected to office. What the moment did leave behind was devastation. Saddam's brutality against his own people couples with a genocide against the Kurds as part of an Arabization campaign in Iraq, and a Syrian regime so power-hungry that it chose to level its cities and gas its people rather than step down. But despite this death and destruction, the ideology receives precious little attention in history books. That's worth correcting, because the story of Baathism is the story of how autocrats seized on politically popular ideas from the far left and fascist groups alike in the name of uniting the Arab world, only to do just about everything in their power to tear it apart. In centuries gone by, Aleppo was one of the biggest cities in the Middle East, ultimately the Ottoman Empire's third largest after Istanbul and Cairo, and drew merchants from around the world. Baghdad, for its part, sat in the cradle of civilization in ancient Mesopotamia, and the later Babylon Empire was once the largest and richest city on earth. Today, nearly 3/4 of Aleppo lies in rubble, and while Iraq is slowly recovering, it's only after decades of war, sanctions, and an occupation that left deep scars on the country. So what happened? How did such historically prosperous states turn into semi-failed states while their Gulf neighbors, places that were largely backwaters when Baghdad and Aleppo were at their peak, were able to become the modern-day power brokers in the region? Well, to understand this transformation, we need to go back to the world in which Baathism emerged, the fallout from the First World War. The Ottoman Empire, which had governed the Arab world for centuries, finally fell in the war's aftermath, leaving the region to be carved up by the imperial victors. The British and French partitioned many of the territories under the Sykes-Picot Agreement, with France seizing Syria and Lebanon, and Britain taking Iraq, modern-day Jordan, and Palestine. Two young Arab intellectuals, Michael Aflaq and Salah al-Din al-Bitar, grew up under this arrangement. Both born in Damascus around 1910, they came of age watching French troops patrolling their streets and French administrators largely running their country. When Syria achieved independence from France in 1946, space opened for domestic Arab political organizations that hadn't existed in decades. The following year, the UN's partition of Palestine delivered a fresh wave of anger through the Arab world, demonstrating that their newfound independence was indeed quite fragile. It was from these upheavals that the two Damascus intellectuals would come to offer a unifying path forward for the region. Aflaq, a Greek Orthodox Christian, and al-Bitar, a Sunni Muslim, founded the Ba'ath Party in 1947, literally meaning rebirth or resurrection in Arabic. Their revolutionary premise rejected both the Ottomans' worldview that carved society along religious fault lines, as well as European mandates that were shaped around national borders. The Ottoman system hadn't placed much emphasis at all on ethnic backgrounds, focusing instead on viewing things through religious divides. In their system, a Christian in Damascus had more in common with a Christian in Baghdad than he did with his Muslim neighbor. Your religious identity determined which courts had jurisdiction over you, what taxes you paid, and who you could marry, sometimes even what neighborhoods you were allowed to live in. For our Western audience, this might sound a bit far-fetched, but for the region, there was a lot of reason behind this, both in terms of how local populations had long related to each other, as well as more self-interested reasons from the Ottomans. Remember, they were themselves largely Turkish Muslims ruling over Arab Muslims, though it wasn't just an imperial imposition. Plenty of Arab elites bought into the system and rose to prominent positions within it, and the Ottomans were naturally inclined to emphasize what they had in common with their subjects rather than what divided them. It was this system of organizing society along religious lines that Aflaq and Bitar sought to overturn. They viewed Arabness as the core aspect that the region had in common, with religious differences being something that tore their world apart. The Arab people, united by language, culture, and blood, had an eternal mission to fulfill. This was full of ethno-nationalism with mysticism mixed into the equation. Religion wasn't seen as a hostile entity in the ways that official atheistic states like the USSR saw it, but more of a private matter to be respected and recognized as being influential on how people lived their lives, just not the organizing principle for the state or society. In this light, Baathism was essentially a secular movement, not atheistic, but there would be a separation of mosque and church. from state. The slogan they adopted for their vision was unity, liberty, and socialism. Unity was perhaps their most radical point. They envisioned not some loose Arab identity that would vaguely unify the divided region, but the creation of an Arab nation across the Middle East, erasing the borders they believed were dividing their people. This is what set the Baathists apart from other Arab nationalist movements. Someone like Gaddafi was very much a part of the broader Arab nationalism movement, but Libya always came first to him. His Arab identity was secondary and never threatened Libyan independence. At least in their early days, the Baathists wanted to dissolve national borders entirely. As for the socialism they championed, it was quite different from the Soviet-style Marxism, with its emphasis on class struggle and workers seizing the means of production. While communist parties did gain traction in parts of the region, including Syria, where they would become a genuine political force by the late 1950s, the Baathists offered an alternative that rejected class as a dividing line. The differentiating factor here was not class, it was ethnicity. Baathists rejected the idea that Arab workers and Arab property owners were in a different class. If anything, they saw such arguments in a similar light that they saw the Ottoman-style religious divisions as something that divided their world, rather than help to define it. While they were certainly supportive of widespread government intervention into the economy, they weren't entirely anti-business either. The state would lead development projects, redistribute land, and nationalize key industries, but private property was seen as perfectly fine to coexist with this system, and private business was never seen as the enemy. They might have wanted large-scale intervention, but they weren't going to be shutting down local grocery stores or seizing the house that your family lives in. While Baathism often gets attributed to left-wing anti-colonialism, and there's certainly quite a bit of it in it, its fascist elements are often downplayed, despite being prevalent from the earliest days. The party's co-founder, Zaki al-Asrouzi, had been associated with the Syrian League of Nationalist Action, who drew a fair share of their worldview from European fascism. Nazi literature was widespread among party elites. Sami al-Jundi, one of the party's leaders, wrote of his time in school by saying, "We were racialists, admiring Nazism, reading its books and the source of its thought. We were the first to think of translating Mein Kampf into Arabic." They were particularly attracted to the racial anti-Semitism found in much of their literature, which really took off after the State of Israel was established in 1948. But whatever ideological movements ultimately shaped them, the founders faced a far more time-sensitive dilemma. How do you sell such a secular ideology to people who oftentimes did see things through the Ottomans' religious divides? Aflaq, despite being Christian, understood that any Arab nationalist movement would have to treat Islam with particular care, essentially arriving at the conclusion that the faith would have to be seen as nothing short of the supreme achievement of Arab culture and Arab history. This wasn't an endorsement of Islam on religious lines. There was to be no Sharia law or religious governance over the country, but rather a secular recognition of the positive influence that it had on the region. The movement really began to spread in earnest throughout the 1950s and into the early 1960s, with branches popping up across Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, and Yemen, all of which were coordinated from Damascus. In Syria itself, the Baathists became the second largest party in parliament by the middle of the decade, marking them as a genuine political and ideological force, which was quite a transformation from the coffee shop-based intellectual foundation they came from. They had the ideology, the party structure, and even a growing base of support across multiple countries. All that was missing was the unity they'd been promising, which they were about to discover was far easier to preach than to practice. In 1957, the Baathists' growing influence in Syrian politics collided with a crisis that would force them to confront what their ideology actually meant. Syrian elites were growing more and more concerned about the prospects of a communist takeover. The party was well organized, a sympathizer had just been appointed chief of staff, and Western powers were openly growing concerned about the country drifting closer to Moscow's sphere of influence. At the same time, Egypt's non-Baathist but equally nationalist Gamal Nasser had become just about the most famous man in the Middle East after standing up to Britain, France, and Israel during the Suez Crisis. The reality of that confrontation was more complicated than his legend suggested. American and Soviet pressure had forced the imperial powers to withdraw, and Egypt's military hadn't exactly performed well in the actual fighting, but none of that mattered to the crowds in Damascus, Baghdad, and Beirut who poured into the streets to celebrate. Here, finally, was an Arab leader who could stand up to the West and win. In a region still feeling the fallout from several decades of colonial rule and the creation of the State of Israel less than a decade earlier, this was a monumental victory. Caught between the wave of Nasser mania sweeping the Arab world, the Baathists tried to deliver on what they believed would be a masterclass move. They pushed for Syria to formally merge with Egypt as one unified country. They got their wish too. The United Arab Republic was formed in February of 1958. Pan-Arab unity, their founding mission, was closer than ever before. Do you know that military phase about the plan not surviving contact with the enemy? Well, the Baathists' plan was about to not survive contact with the enemy. What the Baathists had imagined as a partnership of equals became centralized rule from Cairo, with Egyptians filling key posts and Nasser treating his supposed partners as rivals to be neutralized rather than allies to be empowered. Within 2 years, nearly every prominent Syrian had been pushed out of positions of real influence. The Baathists had dissolved their own party, only to discover they'd handed all their leverage to a man who had no intention of sharing power. When Syrian officers launched a coup in September 1961 and withdrew from the Union, the United Arab Republic collapsed after just 3 years. The founders blamed betrayal and foreign plots. But the younger generation of military officers who had watched their elders get humiliated drew a different lesson. Never again surrender control to rivals who might use their trust to destroy you. Among them was Hafez al-Assad, who had been meeting secretly with a small cadre of disgruntled Baathist officers throughout the UAR years in a group that came to be known as the Military Committee. They weren't intellectuals theorizing about Arab destiny. They were pragmatists who had watched idealism get crushed. 2 years after the UAR's collapse, this military committee seized power in Syria. Iraq's Baathists followed in 1968. One would imagine this would be cause for celebration and unity, given their mutual beliefs in the regional unity along ethnic lines. Right? Well, one would be wrong. The opposite happens, however illogical that might have been from an ideological perspective. Within 3 years of taking power, Syria's Baathists split into rival factions, with each side claiming to be the true party and attempting to purge the other. Michel Aflaq and several other founders were forced out and eventually made their way to Iraq, where the Baathist party there embraced them and declared itself to be the true guardians of the movement's founding principles. Syria's party in turn denounced Iraq's as traitors and fascists. So much for unity. For the next 4 decades, the Baathists would spend more and more energy trying to destroy each other rather than building the unified Arab nation they had promised. The early 1970s saw Hafez al-Assad, father of Bashar al-Assad, consolidate power in Syria, while Saddam Hussein was steadily rising through the ranks in Baghdad, positioning himself to take full control by the end of the decade. Both men understood that ideology could be useful for mobilizing supporters and centralizing control, but raw power was what ultimately ruled the day. This is where the fascist underpinnings that Aflaq had incorporated into the movement revealed what they could become in the hands of power-hungry strongmen with military backing. The nationalism of the founders increasingly became a personality cult, with portraits commonplace throughout the capitals. And the security personnel that enforced this cult grew into something that rivaled the Stasi in East Germany. In Syria, the Mukhabarat planted informants in every corner of life, ranging from taxi drivers to university classrooms. Iraq's eventual apparatus was even more suffocating. By the 80s, 1 in 5 Iraqis was said to be either an informant or a party operative. 1 in 5. By 1979, Saddam had consolidated total control of his country and, within a year, launched a full-scale invasion of Iran, betting that the chaos following the Islamic Revolution had left Iran vulnerable. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The war would drag on for 8 years and kill somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people on both sides. And it was here that the idea of Baathist unity revealed itself to be effectively meaningless. Rather than support his fellow Baathists in Baghdad, Assad actually sided with Iran, which we should probably point out is a non-Arab nation. The movement that claimed to be the pinnacle of Arab unity was now supporting the Persian state as hundreds of thousands of young Iraqis were dying. In Assad's view, Saddam threatened his regime both ideologically and geopolitically, while Iran offered Assad a way out of both of those with free oil shipments on the side. Syria's intervention in the war had a significant impact. It cut off pipelines running to the Mediterranean, costing Baghdad billions in desperately needed revenue, while Syrian intelligence trained Iraqi Kurdish rebels to attack Saddam's forces from a second front. Iraq's Kurdish population, concentrated in the oil-rich northern mountains, were themselves non-Arab and had little role to play in Arab unity. For the Baathists, this sizable group presented a significant challenge that ideology couldn't fix. The solution Saddam adopted was one of forced Arabization, which involved just about everything you'd expect an ethno-nationalist movement to use against minorities that it perceived to be a threat, including forcibly displacing them and replacing them with Arabs, particularly in oil-rich areas. This program was well underway before the war with Iran kicked off, and once it was winding down, Saddam believed that he'd been presented with the opportunity to eliminate the Achilles heel of Iraqi defenses, the Kurds themselves. In March of 1987, Saddam appointed his cousin Ali Hassan al-Majid to command the north with nearly unlimited power. His assignment was clear: complete the Arabization project through whatever means necessary. And what followed was genocide. The Anfal campaign he launched ran from February through September 1988, systematically targeting Kurdish villages across the northern parts of Iraq. The most infamous atrocity took place in the opening months when Iraqi planes dropped mustard gas and nerve agents on the Kurdish town of Halabja, killing over 5,000 civilians in a few hours for the crime of just being who they were. It was from this massacre that Ali Hassan al-Majid got his nickname, Chemical Ali. And yet, for all this, it wouldn't be fair or accurate to characterize Baathism as a pure replica of Nazism, where majority populations are exterminating minorities. Again, in the context of the Middle East, where religion was oftentimes seen as being more important than race or ethnicity, minorities who had claims to Arab identity were oftentimes some of the movement's biggest and earliest supporters. In Syria, this often took the form of Christians, Druze, and especially the Alawites, a breakaway sect of Islam that many Sunnis do not even recognize as being Muslim. In Iraq, there was a similar dynamic that played out a bit differently. Sunnis were a demographic minority, roughly 15 to 20% of the population, but had dominated the country's political institutions since the Ottoman era. Baathism to them was a way to avoid potential Shia repression against them, and they justified it on ideological grounds rather than sectarian ones. What even the movement's founders likely didn't suspect was just how concentrated power would become along sectarian lines. While hard data from the time is difficult to come by, what we can find suggests that over 60% of senior officers in the Syrian military were Alawite in the 90s and around 80% by 2011, despite making up just 12% of the population. Iraq had a similar dynamic, where Sunnis, who, remember, were at most a fifth of the population, absolutely dominated government positions, especially senior roles. Saddam was infamous for prioritizing not just Sunnis, but specifically Sunnis from his hometown of Tikrit for the top jobs. By the late 80s, 7 out of 8 members of Iraq's Revolutionary Command Council came from that city. What had begun as a movement promising to unite all Arabs after decades of divisive imperial rule, regardless of religious background, had dissolved into a pair of authoritarian security states. By the time the 90s rolled around, Baathism was a shell of the ideological promise that it had once made for pan-Arab unity, held together more through fear in the security states in which it ruled the day than anything else. The economic numbers weren't anything to brag about. Iraq's GDP per capita had peaked in 1979 at around $3,900, fueled by oil wealth and genuine development projects, but by the late 90s it had crashed to below $1,000. Syria's decline was slower, given that it was somewhat less of an international pariah, but nevertheless hardly a beacon of economic success. In the early 1960s, it had been roughly on par with other developing countries like South Korea, but by 2000, it sat at $1,200 per capita, while Seoul had surpassed $12,000. Party membership had hollowed out just as much. Both states had reached the point where membership was less about ideological conviction than it was about securing your spot as a member of the elite. Membership was essentially a prerequisite for university admissions and government employment. And they weren't handed out to just anybody either. Syria's Ba'ath Party had just 2 million members, roughly 10% of the pre-Civil War population. If the rank and file had abandoned the ideological purity, though, the leadership had taken it to a different level. When Hafez al-Assad died in 2000, few even bothered pretending the party would select his successor through anything other than inheritance. The late Assad's son, the future president, Bashar, hadn't been groomed for leadership for much of his life. In fact, anything but. He was actually living in London and a practicing ophthalmologist until his older brother Basal, who was the original chosen heir, died in a car crash, at which point Bashar was suddenly recalled to Damascus and given a crash course in authoritarianism. Within hours of his father's death, the nation's parliament passed a constitutional amendment in an emergency session, lowering the minimum age for the presidency from 40 to 34, Bashar's exact age. The Ba'ath Party's regional congress then unanimously proclaimed him as party leader, and a referendum produced a hardly surprising 97% approval. Whether or not Saddam looked down on that number, given his 99.9% yes vote, was lost to the ages. But what we do know is that he was positioning his own country to be set up in case something happened to him by appointing his sons as potential successors, transforming his extension of the party of Arab unity into another branch of nepotism where ideology was a distant second to bloodline. This is a common feature of totalitarian regimes, no matter what the purported ideology. North Korea has made a similar journey into generational rule. Both regimes tried to paper over their founding ideology's collapse, which, to their credit, wasn't always as sustainable as it sounds. Vietnam and China are still both ruled by their communist parties, who retain broad and authoritarian powers over certain areas. But let's be honest, the Ho Chi Minh Stock Exchange isn't exactly what Marx had in mind. Syria tried to mimic this approach, adopting a social market economy in the early 2000s, which was essentially a Chinese-style state capitalism without much of the actual market reform, but with all the corruption that went along with it. Bashar's cousin, Rami Makhlouf, would come to control an estimated 60% of the country's economy through a combination of shell companies and state-backed monopolies, while the state was still adopting slogans of "socialism is alive." At this point, it's worth looking at the reputation these two states had throughout the wider region to get a better sense as to why the movement became so politically bankrupt. While movements like Iran's 1979 Islamic Revolution still have admirers to this day, you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who pointed to either Iraq or Syria and said, "Yes, that's how you run a country." Now, don't get us wrong, there were a few, including even one British member of parliament, the infamous George Galloway, but they were the exception, they weren't the rule. The Ba'ath brand had simply become toxic, synonymous with stagnant and isolated states combined with brutal leaders and equally vicious security services. It should come as little surprise, then, that the Ba'ath parties in neighboring countries had become something of a joke. This was a remarkable fall from the movement's peak in the 50s and 60s, when they held a number of seats in parliaments across the region and were actively expanding to branches as far away as Yemen. In Lebanon alone, they were able to muster a 2,000-man militia force during the country's civil war. But as the decades marched on, and the hollowness of the movement's two namesake states became impossible to ignore, the case to emulate, either of them grew weaker and weaker. By the time the Americans rolled in 2003, Saddam's regime was so tottering that it fell in a matter of days, with army divisions simply laying down their guns and walking away. Many of these soldiers were Shia recruits who had no love for the Sunni-dominated regime, which had managed to hold the country together through fear more than anything else. Once Saddam's ability to make life miserable for his own people was eliminated, it all came crashing down. 21 years later, Syria's Assad, who despite relying on Russian and Iranian support to survive, had nevertheless built a regime whose military had enough loyalty to hold together and fight back, collapsed in a dramatic fashion that few analysts saw coming. Rebels captured the city of Aleppo, and from there it was all downhill. Within a matter of days, they'd swept south and were preparing for their final push into Damascus. Assad knew it was over, and he fled to Moscow. The manner through which the collapse unfolded tells you something you need to know about how Syria had functioned. Just like its Ba'athist rival in Baghdad, it was held together through an intense personality cult and fear of dissent, rather than any genuine belief in what the regime claimed to stand for. The thing is, this lack of belief seemed to extend to the leadership itself. By the end of the civil war, Assad wasn't even pretending to fight for Arab unity or socialism. His propaganda leaned heavily on sectarianism survival, depicting the Sunni militants as existential threats to the Alawites, Christians, and Druze minorities. These groups weren't wrong to be concerned about the dangers. There were an awful lot of extremist militants fighting in the country, but the argument was itself an admission of ideological defeat. The movement that had promised to transcend religious divisions in the names of Arab unity had, in fact, gone full circle and retreated back to them. What Assad left behind is the true testament to Ba'athism. More than 500 million dead, over half the country's pre-war population displaced, 13 million people driven from their homes, with over half of that number fleeing the country entirely. The economy essentially collapsed, losing more than 70% of its GDP output, with its currency cratering by a staggering, wait for it, 99.5% against the US dollar. This is the legacy that Ba'athism leaves behind. A nation in ruins. Yet it wasn't the civil war that killed the movement. It had been dead long before the first protests broke out. By the time Assad's forces were barrel-bombing Aleppo, Ba'athist parties across the region had long since fallen into irrelevance, unable to offer a compelling vision for why anyone should want to emulate Damascus and Baghdad. So what, ultimately, was Ba'athism? The comparison to Nazism is hard to avoid: ethno-nationalism, personality cults, genocide, and forced cultural homogenization. But it was also a creation all its own. The anti-colonial origins were real, and the commitments from its founders to regional unity do appear genuine. The problem with such grand visions of cross-continental unity is that they never held up particularly well upon contact with reality, especially when it came to the question of ethnic minorities who never fit well into the broader vision. Baathism promised to transcend the messy divisions of ethnicity, religion, and geography through the strength of the vanguard party, but the differences they tried to paper over were real, and no amount of mystical language about eternal missions could make them disappear. When the rhetoric failed to deliver, the only things left to hold it all together were force and fear. Thank you for watching.